Hi, I'm Xaq Pitkow, and I'll be talking about rational thoughts in neural codes. Thank you for the invitation to participate in this workshop on integrating theories of the brain. There are two sessions, one on data-driven or AI approaches to integrating theory, and the other theory-driven or mechanism. I'm more of a both-and kind of guy. So the work that I'll be telling you about today is relating the two. You have some data-driven components, some artificial intelligence components. It's all driven by theory, and it has implications for mechanisms, how to think about them. So the overview is I'll tell you about this perspective or framework on rational control. And by rational, we mean the wrong actions, but for the right reasons. I'll talk about equivalences of generating those actions, different ways that you can create the same computations, and the implications of that for how we should analyze neural data in light of a theory about these equivalences and how that should affect latent dynamics and what we should look for. So let's begin. So here's the brain, and oftentimes in neuroscience, we relate measured activity in the brain to measured things in the world, which includes sensory information and motor information. But a lot of the stuff that's happening in the brain is actually not sensory or motor, but something in between, and we don't really yet know well how to characterize that. So we could call that thoughts. So how could we measure a thought such that we can relate that measurement to brain activity and understand the consequences and the implications for how the brain implements those thoughts? Well, we start with the idea that the brain has a model of the world, and the world is evolving over time, maybe not completely in concordance with the brain's model, but there is a state of the world that evolves. And we don't, as brains, get to perfectly understand or know that world state. We only get indirect observations, and that leaves us with a lot of ambiguity. We can use those observations to generate beliefs about the world, and those beliefs evolve over time as we gather new information. Now, the world is structured, and we know that the world is structured, and we exploit some of that structure. And here that structure is manifested graphically as having some arrows, some causal arrows for what variables influence what other variables later in time. So you can see that the arrows point kind of down for these two top circles and up from the bottom back to the top. And this leads to a kind of circulation. This is a cartoon of one causal structure that you might see. Now, our brain may have a parallel structure. In good cases, it would know the structure of the world, and maybe it makes some erroneous assumptions about the way the world works. And our observations, as we parse them by our brain tissue, is divided into things that are relevant for different aspects of the world that we see. And so that informs our beliefs. Now, the world is stochastic, and that means that there's a lot of uncertainty about what we're actually seeing and how the dynamics evolve that we don't get perfect information about. And that means that our beliefs are not just a copy of the world state, but instead should capture multiple numbers per variable of interest. And that would be something like a best guess plus your uncertainty about it. And there might be joint uncertainty. So there's more numbers that the brain has to represent in order to capture the dynamics of the world than just the variables it's capturing. The world is also nonlinear. The dynamics and updates of the world are complicated. And although it might be that in some cases the brain tries to update its world estimates in one step, it's easier for the brain, using its actual hardware and the mechanisms that it has available, to update them in multiple steps using intermediate or auxiliary variables that are represented in some other neural populations, or maybe in the very same population, just in different dimensions. So this is going on over time. There's also no reason that the number of neurons that you need to compute is the same as the number of beliefs that you have. So there might be a distributed code with, in fact, there's lots of evidence that there is, the information is distributed across many neurons. And so the dynamics of all of these neurons, there may not be any beliefs explicitly anywhere, but it may be just implicit in these populations. This is the metaphor that I like to think about. And so now, as you're going along and updating these belief dynamics implicitly in the populations, those are driving actions. So the behavioral model that we use to describe what we're thinking is based on a belief, but causally speaking, really what's going on is that, of course, the neurons are driving the actions. But we find it very convenient and theoretically helpful to consider that the beliefs are driving the actions. And we just know that those beliefs are implemented by a bunch of neurons. So our overall hypothesis here is that there are latent variables about the world, in fact, probabilistic ones, that are distributed across neurons, and they perform implicit inference and select actions through the nonlinear dynamics. And those nonlinear dynamics pertain to the beliefs that we have about the world. Now, if you go back over 100 years, Helmholtz proposed that our brain is performing unconscious inference. And the implication of that and of many others' theories is that there's a match between the brain and the world. That's been really fruitful as a way of generating hypotheses about the world and generating testable predictions. And sometimes the brain is, in fact, very close to optimal, which is remarkable and marvelous. But many other times, the brain falls short of what we would consider to be optimal. And we know from plenty of experience with human foibles how true that is. So how then do we get any guidance from theory? If the theory tells us the best thing to do, there are so many ways to be wrong. What kind of guidance could we get? Well, what if the agent, in this case the brain or an animal, is wrong but rational? That means doing the wrong things but for the right reasons, have some justification for what's going on, and we can rationalize those actions as being right under the wrong assumptions. So we developed a framework to formalize this idea, which we call inverse rational control. And so we assume that the agent is optimal, but under some subjective assumptions, which may not match whatever experiment they're being measured in. Then we observe the agent's actions and the sensory observations of the agent, and we estimate a model, theta, for the dynamics, the uncertainties, the rewards, the action costs, all the assumptions that the animal has about the world. Along the way, we have to infer the latent beliefs that dictate those actions. And we put all that together to come up with a marginal likelihood over the observations and actions that we see given the model. And we optimize that marginal likelihood over models. In other words, we parameterize agents by the task that they solve best. And then we solve for all possible policies within that task family. So for each family member theta, some tasks, some assumptions, we come up with the policy pi for choosing the actions from a given belief. And again, given the model, given the assumptions. We then use that policy to compute a likelihood over the sensory data. And that gives us a likelihood over all tasks, which we then maximize to find the best interpretation of animal behavior as rational, that is optimal under the assumptions of theta. And we've shown for simulated agents that this successfully recovers false beliefs. So, for example, in this publication that's listed down below, we have an agent who is foraging between a couple of boxes, choosing when to look in the box for food, and making sensory observations about the likely quality of that box. Along the way, the true agent that we've simulated has some real beliefs, which are shown in blue. And we are also showing here this grayscale in the background, which is our posterior over those beliefs. So our probability over their probability. And you can see that there's a very nice agreement between the inferred beliefs and the actual beliefs of this suboptimal behaving animal or simulated animal. So this is very encouraging, and we are now deeply involved in testing this in animals in real tasks And hopefully we'll have some cool results to report to you in the not too distant future. Now, this is all behavior. And so what happens when we start to look inside the brain, which is ultimately the goal here? Well, we need to have some model of how that information, all that probabilistic information, the beliefs that the animal has about the world, how they might be manifested in neurons. We're looking for that, and we want to know what properties it has. So one possibility is that we could have a model with a really clear correspondence between the factors in the world and the factors in the brain. Groups of neurons would then represent individual aspects that are driving these variables or causing those variables to interact. So the circles here represent variables, the squares represent evidence about those variables or interactions between those variables. And we have a model that says how these things should interact if you're implementing them by population codes. But this right here is really like a grandmother cell representation. And so it may well be possible, or I would say likely, that all of those things are mushed together into a big population of neurons with overlapping tuning, mixed selectivity. And there's a lot of evidence for this, although there is some segregation for different types of modalities and different types of variables as well. So now we have this population, partially overlapping groups of neurons that are encoding things, and they're still circulating information much in the same way, sharing information to get better estimates and inferences. But now it's done at the population level implicitly in some interacting projections or interacting high-dimensional patterns of activity. So this becomes complicated. How do we even think about that? And at the same time, you might ask, well, there could be multiple ways of implementing the same computations. And that would be what we often call mechanism. But there are many mechanisms that can generate the same computations. And so to some degree, I would advocate looking for the abstract qualities that those mechanisms have in common, rather than focusing on the biophysical details. There are some cases where you want to, when you're dealing with interventions, you want to figure out which neurons to zap or what pharmaceuticals to apply. But oftentimes, to understand the computational function, it's good to take this more abstract view. So for example, here we might have a quadratic function, a square, that we want to apply to some information that's represented by a population of neurons here. And you could implement that square by a bunch of quadratic products of these neurons and then sum those together to get an estimate. But equivalently, you can have a bunch of threshold linear units that you just add together. And if you uniformly distribute their thresholds, the result is, again, a quadratic function. And so I would say in many cases, it's not super important which one of these is happening in the brain if we want to understand the computational function. Now, once we take that perspective where we're really interested in the task relevant aspects and this more abstract property of the mechanism that's going on, then I think it's really helpful to refer to this neural coding framework of partially overlapping processes of encoding, recoding, and decoding. So encoding here refers to how neurons relate to the stimuli. And decoding is how the neurons drive their behavior, the behavior of the animal. Recoding is all the stuff in the middle where neurons are transforming their information. Now, oftentimes, the decoder is the experimentalist or the neuroscientist who's decoding the neural activity. Here, it's the brain decoding its own activity. And so it's the same process, it's just a different thing doing the decoding. And I think that this breakdown of encoding, recoding, decoding is very helpful. So when we're thinking about that, I like to think about the task relevant projections or coordinates in the manifold of neural activity. So neural activity is restricted to some low dimensional subgroups or patterns, which we usually refer to as a manifold. But within that manifold, there are different coordinates, some of which are task relevant, like the coordinates at the top of this kind of smushed box, and some of them are irrelevant, like the green coordinate here. So if we look at this orange line, that orange line is the dynamics of a particular set of task variables during one task, traces out some coordinates in this belief space. And then orthogonal to that are all the irrelevant directions. And so the set of irrelevant coordinates that all have the same task relevant coordinates, that traces out a ribbon over time, in this case, a one-dimensional ribbon. And any trajectory within that ribbon, going up and down, following the same orange trajectory, is going to give you the same task performance. So here you see this black line wiggling back and forth. This might be the neural activity at a population level, wiggling around, all consistent with this same task dynamics. And so I would advocate that this reduction from the full manifold down to this task relevant space is really what we want to think about and understand for a lot of the computational properties of what the brain is doing for these tasks. And so we tried this perspective on the simulated data that I showed you before with the inverse rational control. And here we have the encoding of the beliefs on the horizontal axis, which are predicted from inverse rational control. So this is what our behavioral model thinks the animal is thinking. And the vertical axis is what we would predict from the neurons. So first, basically, we do a regression here. We say, okay, here is the encoding. This is the dimension or coordinates where that belief is represented. And then we cross-validate. And so the cross-validation shows that you can recover from these neural projections a good estimate of the belief predicted from the behavior, which is, again, it's latent. So there's not a ground truth here, but this is a good explanation or rationalization of the behavior. So then once we have a good estimate that we say, all right, we're satisfied with this encoding model, we can then ask how the dynamics work or the computations work by looking at the recoding. And this means on the horizontal axis here, we're looking at the change in the belief, which is predicted from the behavioral model. And then we compare that on the vertical axis to the change in the belief in the neural beliefs, that same coordinate or set of coordinates according to the encoding model. And you can see there's a nice diagonal here, even within a given color, which is constraining to one particular set of observations or one particular time period. So it's not just that they're driven solely by the observations, but in fact, even within the observations, there are fluctuations going back and forth based on history, and the neural beliefs match the behaviorally inferred beliefs. So this is, again, a nice success that you're able to interpret the neural data in accordance with this behavioral model, and that the neural dynamics explain or recapitulate the inferred behavioral dynamics, or the inferred latent beliefs that motivate the behavior. And then finally, you can look at the behavior itself and say, how often does this agent pick different actions according to the behavioral model and according to the neural model? And again, we get a good agreement here. So this is more encouraging suggestion that this type of approach, where you have a good behavioral model for latent beliefs or latent dynamics, and the low dimensional projection or low dimensional manifold that explains the task relevant space, that can be really fruitful for understanding real brains. So let's see. Well, that's work for the future, but I'll just conclude here by saying, in summary, we presented this framework of inverse rational control, which views the brain as rational but not optimal, and that gives us theoretical guidance on the kind of suboptimality that you would expect to see in the brain, or that we can use to interpret the brain. Now, the mechanisms by which those computations are performed, there are many, and they could be in lots of different forms, but we can collapse many of them down to equivalent computations. And I would say that that's a very satisfactory understanding of what's going on in the brain. Now, there are really crucial questions about generalization, and some of these equivalent computations that are equivalent for one task may be quite distinct for another task. And so then that would allow you to test whether that mechanism is correct by just looking at its generalization performance, which is a key challenge in any model of the brain. But once you have this notion of equivalences, you can use dimensionality reduction or other related techniques to study the computational dynamics within that latent variable space that's task relevant. Even when that's distributed across neurons, particularly this is important when the information is distributed across neurons. So we can find what patterns of collective behavior, collective activity are responsible for producing that behavior. So that's what I have for you today, and I want to thank all the amazing scientists who contributed to this effort. The inverse rational control stuff was led by Zhengwei Wu and Minhei Kwan, with major contributions from Sarab Daptardar. And this has been a very fruitful collaboration with Paul Schrader for a good period of time. And then we have a bunch of experimental collaborators who have been working on these same tasks with us. And I hope to report soon on some of the data that we're getting from their lab and our analyses of it. The neural coding stuff was done by Raj Kumar Raju and Zhe Li and Qianli Yang, as well as a bunch of other collaborators that we're trying to apply that work on. And so thank you for your attention. Thank you to the funding agencies who made all this work possible. And if you are interested in applying any of these frameworks to your stuff, give me a call or drop me a line. xaq@rice.edu is my email. And I hope to hear from you, and I look forward to the upcoming debate.